Okay, welcome everybody to today's webinar. And today's webinar is called Investing in Nature, People and Livelihoods. And so as people are still joining today, it might take a few people a while to log in. There's some basic housekeeping rules for us to go through. The first of those is the structure for today, which is we're going to hear from each of our two speakers for roughly 15 minutes each. And we'll follow that with a discussion and then a little Q&A session. If you do have questions, please pop them into the Q&A section at the bottom of your Zoom screen there, and Ciarán will assist with that and direct them to our speakers afterwards. In the chat then, if you have any, if we have any relevant links and resources, we'll populate them in there. And we do invite people to let us know where you're from, both your location and your company. We'd love to hear where you're joining us from. And please note, finally, this is our last webinar on the Connecting Nature Enterprise platform for the summer. We'll come back in September, October with some great stuff planned across different tree sensor technology, water management, and a project on regenerative ocean farming. So we'll bring back that to you in the autumn. And finally, this is a non-smoking flight, and we do have sensors in the bathrooms and in the air cabin. So refrain from smoking. So look, at the Connecting Nature Enterprise platform today, we're honored to welcome today's guests for a session on ecosystem restoration and regenerative forestry. We're joined by Ciarán Fallon, who is Managing Director at the Nature Trust, which is a not-for-profit involved in regenerative forestry. And Ciarán's also the director of Coillte Nature, the not-for-profit branch of Ireland's forestry body. In a previous life, I've learned that Ciarán also introduced the Dublin bike scheme that we're all very grateful for, one of the most successful, let's say, green transport schemes in the country. So our other speaker today is Alan McDonnell. He's the Conservation and Programme Development Manager with Trees for Life in Scotland. Trees for Life, for those who don't know, was founded by the renowned Alan Watson Featherstone with a mission to rewild the Scottish Highlands. And I first met Alan in a pub beside a bog in the middle of Ireland. He had given a talk to the Irish Wildlife Trust about this project in the Afric Highlands. So I know it's going to be interesting. So both gentlemen, anyway, will talk to us about their work. We'll then jump into this discussion I've mentioned. And so without further ado, I would like to introduce Ciarán first. Welcome, Ciarán.
Hi, everybody. It's great to be here today. I'm just bringing up my screen. Maybe you can confirm, Ciarán, if you can see that.
We can see that, yeah.
Brilliant. Let's just try and get the slideshow going. How's that?
Bingo. Cool.
Well, look, it's really nice to be here today. I was actually in that pub with you that day and met Alan that day as well. So great to reunite here. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Nature Trust, which is the not-for-profit social enterprise that we mentioned. But first, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Coillte. As you mentioned, Coillte is the state forestry company in Ireland. Coillte, actually in Irish and Gaelic, means woods or woodlands. I think it's the same in Scots Gaelic. Alan, you can confirm that when it's your turn to go. It is thumbs up. Okay, very good. Just a very quick context setter. Ireland has a very low level of forest cover. You can see this is a graph of forests versus other woodlands within the EU 27, and we're just ahead of Malta, but otherwise bottom of the table along with the Netherlands. Very, very low levels of forest cover. I mean, in our ancient history, 8,000 years ago, landscape was almost comprehensively forested. People think between 85 and 90% forest cover, but through successive waves of deforestation, initially through Neolithic peoples settling land and clearing land for agriculture, then lands being cleared in the Iron Age and the Bronze Age for charcoal production, and in the more recent centuries, over exploitation for fuel and building materials. But when Ireland, the new state of Ireland, the modern Republic of Ireland, was formed 100 years ago, the level of forest cover in Ireland was less than 1%. So extremely low levels of forest cover in Ireland. And the new state set about trying to change that by an afforestation program, so planting new woodlands on bare lands, on lands that weren't otherwise forested. And that really kicked off in earnest in the middle of the last century, in the early 1950s. You can see the lime green is the kind of the public estate, and that's Coillte, the state-owned forestry company. And then the white that begins to become prominent in the 80s is private forestry. So this is the incentivization of farmers in Ireland to become foresters. So you can see most of the forestry starts off as being public forestry done directly by the state, by civil servants. And later on, that's joined by private forestry. So today, the forests in Ireland, this 11% of cover, is roughly 50-50 between the public estate, Coillte, and the private estate, private foresters, about 25,000 small private foresters who are becoming part of the forestry program. And their forests are beginning to mature now, and that timber is beginning to reach market for the first time. Because of the, I suppose, because of the young nature of our forest estate is super young, it's just 100 years young. The people who are planting it were seeking to address an economic problem, social problem, and they needed returns quite quickly. So they went with very fast growing species. So the composition of the Irish forest estate is it's 2/3 conifers and less than 1/3 broadleafs. And within that third of broadleafs, particularly small area of native Irish woodlands. And I'm going to come to that later on because that was our challenge. So this is the Coillte estate on the left-hand side. You can see if you're dialing in from outside Ireland, this is Ireland here. The green dots are the properties of the individual forests. So we have about 6,000 forests, so lots of relatively small forests. Generally, they were planted on land that was not good enough to sustain agriculture. So if it could sustain agriculture, it was redistributed to people who were seeking to farm it in the early decades of the new state. And really our forestry estate is on mainly uplands. It occupies 7%. The Coillte estate occupies 7%, a little bit over 7% of Ireland. And currently we manage about 1/5 of it, 20%, primarily for biodiversity. And we're in the process of increasing that from 20% to 30% within the next 2 years. It's an open access estate, so very large estate, open to the public, and we estimate we have 18 million visits per year. So a big open recreational area. And I know, Ciarán, you use it. You use the Wicklow Mountains on your doorstep for recreation.
I'm out there every weekend.
Out there every weekend. Very good, very good. My area is called Coillte Nature. So this is part of the business, it's a not-for-profit part of the business that does large-scale nature restoration projects across 4 thematic areas. One is afforesting our landscapes, so planting new native woodlands. The second is rehabilitating ecosystem services, so doing large nature restoration projects on the Coillte estate. And what you see in the background is the restoration of peatland habitats. So there's, during this early days of forestry, which I described in my very first slide, people with good intentions went out and planted up areas of Western blanket bog. And we now know, looking back, that wasn't a good thing from a climate perspective or a biodiversity perspective, or even from a forestry perspective, because these lands are not very well suited to growing commercial trees. So our projects in this area are around peatland rehabilitation. We also do what we call regenerating urban forests, which are basically trying to develop forests near cities. And our flagship project there is a network of 700 hectares of forests on the edge of Dublin, Ireland's capital city. You can see one of my colleagues looking down on the city. These were planted up when the city was much smaller, but now they are almost reaching the city and are a major recreational resource. So we're converting those. And the final part are addressing major biodiversity projects on the estate. So it's a project focused team, and we use Coillte, the parent company's resources. So all our work is done by Coilte's professional foresters and by our network of contractors on the ground. But it was really this piece on the left, the afforesting landscapes, which is what I wanted to speak about today, because native Irish woodlands are slow to mature. So they take a long time to grow. So there isn't a conventional commercial business case for buying land and planting it with native trees. It takes a long time for them to mature. And we wanted to plant more because we wanted to address this imbalance and try to diversify the estate and grow more native woodlands. But we had to try and find a way of making this work and financing it. And we came up with this idea of the Nature Trust. And how it came about was almost as soon as Coillte Nature was launched, and particularly the Dublin Mountains project, which had quite a big public launch and was well known, I started getting this stream of calls from organizations who were really interested in being associated with native woodlands and were asking me would I plant them for them. And we don't plant for other people in Coillte. We manage our own estate. So I redirected them to private forestry companies and to NGOs and so on. But then curiosity would get the better of me, and I often called back to see how things went. And invariably, it didn't go anywhere. So I started to think we were missing something here. And a lot of these organizations definitely had the right motivation. And very often they had great resources that could be used because these projects are very capital intensive. So we set up a round of meetings with them to try and understand what their needs were. And we found they were looking for things really around, they wanted projects that were EU taxonomy compliant. They were looking for projects that they could claim were genuinely additional, so they wouldn't happen without their involvement. They were looking for as much permanence or assurance of permanence that they could get. Of course, nothing is permanent in the world, but the greatest assurance of permanence it could get. And they were seeking to avoid double counting. So in other words, be involved in projects with an assurance that nobody else could claim those projects. And then finally, it was important, if possible, that the projects could have open public access. So they were something that was accessible to people and something they could achieve in Ireland. So after having these conversations, we realized, well, maybe there is something we can do here. And we set about kind of designing up I suppose, some models, some kind of straw men. And we came up, to cut a long story short, this idea of the Nature Trust, which is a separate not-for-profit company that sits outside Coillte. It's legally separate from Coillte, has its own board, an independent board from Coillte. Coillte participates in the board, but it's separate. And Coillte helps by supplying services to the company on a not-for-profit basis, and a donation of services. So it gives it the power to do things on a large scale, but keeps it separate. And that gives the funders the confidence that when they put money into this project, it's held within the Nature Trust in perpetuity on their behalf. There's a registry where their lands are registered, and we manage it on their behalf into the future. We say in perpetuity. Very often in contracts, we specify that as 100 years. So just to give a contract completeness, but the articles in the constitution of the company make it clear that if the directors ever wanted to wind up the company or ever found the need to wind up the company, they would have to find a charitable organization with the same aims and values as the Nature Trust and vest the assets in that. So they can never be felled, they can never be used for commercial purposes. They have to be used for this nature purpose. So the Nature Trust then, its purpose in its articles say to create, restore wild natural ecosystems by acquiring land, improving the ecological condition of the land, and managing its ecosystems in perpetuity in order to deliver benefits for climate, nature, communities, and wider society. And I think I've touched on most of the points in the blue there. Basically, it's quite a simple model. We use the capital that comes in to buy land. We are also eligible for various government incentives to encourage people to plant native woodlands. We combine them, leverage one off the other to buy as much land as we can, plant with native trees, and report back to the funders on the improvements on that land over time under 3 headings, under carbon, biodiversity, and well-being headings. So simple as that. It's a very simple model. There's the team. Mainly, I'm the leader of the team. We've Declan Little will be a key person here. He's our ecological manager. Declan, for those of you watching from Ireland, may know Declan. He was very, very respected forester, and he ran Woodlands of Ireland, an NGO in Ireland, for over 20 years. And we've recently added Dermot Tiernan on the right there, and Dermot's a peatlands expert, because you'll hear we've actually gone from native woodlands to diversified into peatland restoration more recently. The schematic, the model itself, is kind of laid out here. The Nature Trust is the not-for-profit entity in the middle. It was founded by Quilcha and a pre-existing NGO called Forestry Partners. This was an NGO that was in the market. It was formed by a tech entrepreneur, a guy called John Beckett, who, in a real tech startup way, just decided to go out and do it himself. Bought land, started planting up trees, and was working in this area, just his own passion. And as we were looking at the area, his name came up a number of times. We spoke to John, had a couple of cups of coffee, realized our ambitions were very similar, and we were working in the same area. And eventually we decided to throw our lot in together and work together. And I think actually on our board, John's brought some really interesting people onto the board who, from a tech background, and really kind of pushed us in terms of growth and ambition, which has been great. It's kind of an interesting cultural mix between forestry and tech. Forestry can sometimes is very long-term in its focus. Foresters really think about the future, the stewardship, the long-termness is foremost in foresters' mind. I think our tech colleagues have brought a kind of an urgency to it and a drive, and a kind of challenging us to scale and challenging us to really move. So it's a lovely dynamic. And as a DMD, I find it very stimulating because I have both sides really pulling me. The funding, if you look at this as a clock, it comes in at 3 o'clock. Bank of Ireland is one of the pillar banks in Ireland that's acted as an intermediary for us. It finds the fundraise, or has in the past found investors for us, funders for us. We combine those with government-based grants and premiums, and we buy the land, which we plant with new native woodlands, what are called GPC 9 and 10 native woodlands. And then we represent the investment with what we call a unit called a nature woodland credit, and that we report back on the carbon sequestration. The biodiversity benefit, nature benefit is written here, and biodiversity benefit are interchangeable, and the well-being benefit. And services are provided here in this model with Quilcha Nature. I manage it, my team manages it, and we use the woodland management and land acquisition services of Quilcha. We also deal with private forestry companies and private companies. And in fact, most of our planting to date, and nearly all of our planting to date, has been done by private forestry companies. So it's important that we see this as an organization that deals. It is backed by Quilcha, but it's separate from Quilcha. So 1 year of operation. We're actually a year and a half, 10 days ago in operation. We've raised €7 million in funding for native woodlands. And recently, as I mentioned, we've raised another €2.5 million for peatland restoration. So really going well. We're not constrained by finance. Actually, we're actually have our plate full at the moment. It's really land availability is our big challenge at the moment, getting enough land. We're about halfway through our 610 hectare commitment that we've raised funding for. We're a little bit over 315, I think, is our current figure today. So halfway around that. And we're looking at peatland finance or peatland projects. And we're also being approached around rewilding projects, and we're looking at putting together a pure rewilding project very soon. There's a lot of interest in that. We're trying to put something in the shop window and supply those needs. The future, I'll wrap up very quickly. I think it's an interesting area, but it's an emerging area, and it's an area I think that needs more standards because it's quite open and standards and regulations are following behind it. And of course, there's always concerns around standards being met and misreporting and greenwashing and permanence. And the whole thing is based on trust. So I would like to see regulation and standards, international standards, accepted standards, catching up quickly, because it will suit the nature of trust. We try to operate to high standards. We want to make sure the floor is suitably high, and all this area is being done well. And that we keep our own registry at the moment. I'd like to see centralized registry so everybody can see who owns what and who's claiming what. And we need to know what's acceptable for companies to be able to claim, because I've seen everything from, really, really respectable companies with genuine ambitions on real science-based transitions, right through to companies that are frankly, the commitment to decarbonization is very weak and are looking for things really to dress that up. And we need to, as a society, decide what are the standards, what's acceptable. We have developed very robust accounting standards, which we protect our finances with. So we need similar standards in this area. So it is strongly regulated. So I'll conclude there. I think I've done my 15 minutes. I think it's got a bright future, but it's not a silver bullet. And it's been an interesting model, an interesting 18 months so far. I think it needs to mature.
Thank you, Ciarán. That was really good and bang on time. Don't know how you did that, but
I have a watch beside my screen.
Judging by your track record, you have in a year and a half, you're already 50% towards your target of 600 plus hectares. So that is a phenomenal achievement, I think, already. Look, there's a couple of questions coming in the Q&A for you, but we will hold those, if attendees don't mind, we'll hold those till the end, just in the interest of time, because what we would like to do next is hear from Alan McDonnell from Trees for Life for another 15 or so minutes, and then we'll get into a discussion and address those questions, if that's okay. So without further ado, again, welcome to Alan. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Ciarán, and I'm just going to share here as well. Just got a few slides to go through. Yeah, thanks for having me along. I'm good. Yeah, thanks for having me along today, guys. Really good to speak in this kind of debating area, because there's a lot of things that Ciarán just talked about that are very similar to where we are, but we're in a different context over in Scotland. In some ways, quite unique in Europe, actually, with some of the circumstances we're dealing with. But I think that kind of contrast can be instructive. So I'm going to talk about Africa Highlands, and this is Trees for Life's big move, really, to change a landscape in a way that really lasts and speaks to the scale of the challenges and the complexity of some of the problems at a human level, because I think it's at that level that a lot of these kind of decisions are made. And we'll talk about two of the key levers we've got for change, and some of that does relate to those issues Ciarán was just talking about, how you bring the finance in to make this happen in a way that leads to genuine change. So yeah, this slide here shows a kind of previous incarnation of Africa Highlands. When it was born, we called it East West Wild. There's a long story as to why we changed that, but this is just to give you an idea of scale. Trees for Life, I should say, just works in the Highlands of Scotland. So we're founded there, and we're an outwardly rewilding charity, and we step into some of the issues and reactions that word can bring. But part of rewilding and part of what Africa Highlands is about is scale. So that's about 2,000 square kilometers of the Highlands, 500,000 acres, and it's part of a landscape that's been contested for a long part of history. That 2,000 square kilometers is owned by a bit less than 50 people, and some of them, probably only a fraction of them, maybe own like over half of that. So there's quite a concentration of where the decision-making control lies and has lain. And over centuries, in fact, there's been conflict over how decisions are made about that land, who's affected by that. And through the kind of second half of the 20th century and coming into this one, land management is right at the center of that. And I guess a a tension between environmental enhancement, environmental restoration, and traditional land management. So lots of reasons to kind of fracture apart that have kind of driven division into this landscape. And we're looking to replace that with a more shared vision of the future. We see the potential for that, and we see the energy for that. Actually, people are, I think, pretty tired of conflict. That's definitely part of the discourse we're entering. And really what this kind of started for us, then when we're actually, everybody in this landscape has a shared interest in its nature, in the people that live there, and the economy that underpins both of those. So that's kind of, we're saying, let's take what we value in that, look to build that into a time frame 30 years down the line, and take those 50 or so landowners, the 2,300 people or so that live in this community, and let's see what we can forge together in a way that restores nature, addresses climate change, and lets communities thrive. So some of the potential for that, this is Glen Affric, and it's really just the slides here to really just show how ecologically degraded this landscape is. That's actually looking east down Glen Affric into probably one of the best ecological parts of Affric Highlands, where there's remnant ancient forest there. This kind of brown patch, if you can see my cursor there, has regenerated in the last 15 years or so, 20 years maybe. So there's huge potential here, but actually so much of the landscape is this kind of familiar purple moor grass, very limited diversity, very limited habitat. And we want to replace that with something that's much more diverse. So a mosaic of native woodlands coming back, rivers that are tree lined and can thrive as a result of that, and the peatlands restored, and a whole gradation of kind of open and tree covered habitats in between that, so which could be really rich for wildlife. But to do that, there's a real weight in the status quo, because the land looks like that after 2 centuries of use, and the way people have been using that land for livelihoods. So there's a biophysical challenge in that, there's an economic challenge in that, but also socially, and the way people are used to managing land, and psychologically how they perceive it's there. But for us, the potential is, and the point to intervene at is in the scope to restore nature, because at the end of the day, everybody has that in common, and we can see that as a bit of a catalyst for regeneration. So far, so normal for an ENGO kind of narrative, but I think what's important for us, and what's really helped us to engage people in conversation, is to acknowledge the importance of repeopling, and seeing how these landscapes, these glens once held, a much bigger population, people who lived off the land. So how do we build that into the future is one of the key challenges. If we can't do that, we don't think that future will be sustainable. If there aren't people connected to the land and using it and living from it in a sustainable way, then sooner or later nature will collapse around that as well, because we'll see more economic forces come in, and that will change over time. So how do we, instead of seeing this kind of perceived changes in ways of life and perceived changes in land-based livelihoods, present them instead as opportunities, and almost try to frame the conversation as, yeah, you can take this down the old roads of conflict, but that's a choice you make. You can also choose to talk about what's possible now. And there are new forces now that are making that possible. And actually we could kind of reinterpret the historic culture here, the Gaelic culture of the Highlands, and how connected to the land that was. There can be a modern equivalent of that, and it's for us collectively to map out what that might look like. So that everybody says that's all great in terms of a nice vision of the future, and nobody can disagree with that. How are you actually going to do it? And often that comes down to the economic side. Where are these jobs going to be? And we're making the case that actually this landscape has more potential for jobs than it currently is delivering. So there are traditional land use jobs in this landscape, and we want to build on them. Deer stalking is probably, in this part of the Highlands, probably one of the foremost of them. So people coming to pay to shoot stags and deer in the Highlands. We need that in the future. We need to build on that. And actually, one of the elephants in the room sometimes that we always look to name is the way the deer population influences the habitat and influences the ability of the landscape to recover. So they're kind of out of balance. We feel, and increasingly it's accepted now in Scotland, that the red deer population needs to come down significantly. That's driving the stalking community to feel that their jobs are under threat. And so there's a body of work to do to sort of to show them that actually they're vital to the future, and that we need more of those jobs going forward. But in addition, there are other jobs that are land-based as well that are really important. So farming and producing food, forestry to produce timber products, non-timber forest products, and the job of restoring land itself. That, you know, the digger there working on restoring a bog. These actually can be nature friendly. They can be sustainable, and can be large scale. They actually peatland work. We cannot provide enough capacity to restore the huge areas of peatland in African Islands, and the finance for that actually can be quite significant from a jobs point of view. Some of those jobs and some of those businesses might be quite small in economic terms, but they can be significant in the local economy. People can work in a cooperative way to market themselves, invest together if large capital outlay is needed, and that in turn can help actually create a bit of a sort of financial ecosystem locally, so that money that's when you create a product locally, you add the value to it locally. You don't send it off to some central place just as raw material. You sell it as a product that's been developed, and therefore you're keeping more of the value there, and you create more scope for that money to circulate in the economy. So this idea of sticky money in the Highlands is something we very much want to get to. And alongside all of that, what is growing inexorably and with or without rewilding is tourism. And so that brings negatives as well. And so there's an important conversation to be had about how you get to probably slower tourism that minimizes the downsides and makes the most of the income that can come there. That is, whether you like it or not, a vital part of where we're going. But equally, it's we can't have just tourism. And I think that's really important, that people feel that actual stuff is getting made from this landscape and they have a sense of pride in that. And then the natural capital side of things is we do see as very much as an emerging economic factor. And Ciarán was just talking, it was really interesting to hear you talking there, Ciarán, about how that's working through the Nature Trust. For us, we are using this really, if you imagine Trees for Life as, you can probably think of an ENGO, you know, and what its relationship with some of the sort of, I guess, non-environmental interest in a landscape might be, and the tension around that. We've worked hard to kind of find a way to opening conversations with these landowners who might be a wee bit wary of what we're about and the change that we're bringing, and to say, actually, this sort of nature restoration can be in your interests. And one of the things we point to there is this idea of natural capital income. And I think what's really important at this stage is it feels like it's very much emerged. It feels like a brand new market, much the way Ciarán was describing that plea for standards at the end. This is a time when that's going to be shaped. This is the kind of time, and you can generate natural capital in ways that maybe aren't necessarily really going to deliver for nature. That impact could be limited if we don't get it right. Socially, it could have negative impact. So we need to build this around some principles about there being real impact there, thinking about how the communities relate to this, and some of the principles that perhaps come from United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So we need natural capital that's a force that supports nature restoration, supports communities, and integrity is the standard word for that. That's what you hear a lot. We have found we own about 4,000 hectares of African Islands, a place called Dundragon, and we have a carbon product there, a woodland carbon product there, where people in the voluntary carbon market buy carbon offset units from us. Those carbon offset units are vetted by a third party, and people are interested in the value they perceive in that and the story that we tell them around that. So people are interested in the fact that it's from the Scottish Highlands, that as an organisation like Trees for Life is directly related to our rewilding mission. So nature restoration is its primary purpose, not carbon sequestration, that it's permanent, and that there are authentic nature-based benefits from that. But also we share a third of the revenue from that with the local community. And we're interested in that as a model that can go forward and show a tangible benefit from this kind of restoration for communities. So the idea of trying to float all the boats as another wave of land use change comes across the Highlands. This time there's an opportunity for communities to share in that and for all that interest not to come to private hands. And what's key to that is price. So in our view, whether it's carbon or a broader set of natural capital based products, the value needs to be high, and therefore the story needs to be strong. And we need to be able to talk to buyers about this is what, if you want to see change, you want to support positive change, this is the integrity you should be looking for. So we're looking to understand particularly where the buyer is coming from, and to set a standard that actually buyers need to be thinking about their integrity across the piece. Carbon is key to that, but there'll be other ideas about nature footprint as well. We want to look into that. And again, communicate this idea of integrity so that we say the price is high for these reasons, it costs money. And for that, we're also anticipating that there'll be a need for a more systematic approach to how natural capital is measured. So we have, at the minute we sell carbon with a story, is what we say. We're not far off the point now where the market is going to demand that, but also going to demand metrics, actually demonstrate the impacts and the evidence behind the claims you're making. So we're starting to step into that area where it's about data, and that's going to be key to the future. And that's going to need, so measuring ecological impacts, but also social ones. I saw the question in the chat there about, do we measure social impacts? At the minute in African Highlands, we don't, but we're starting to research what that should look like and understand if funds are coming, whether from natural capital or businesses that are kind of benefiting from the rewilding of the landscape, how are those funds governed? And where do they go, and how do they have the impact that the community needs? So finding a way where the community is participating in the decision making about what's done with those resources in a fair way that's not too bureaucratically heavy to function, that's going to be a key challenge. So all of this stuff and how we use these measurements and the technology we have to glean that data is going to be complicated, and that's going to be an ongoing journey. So really, as this kind of weight, this kind of scale of finance comes in, and we're looking at, Ciarán was talking about working with, we're an ecological organization. We're now working with finance people and technological people using data, and it's starting to, it can feel very alien and a little concerning about, well, is nature getting commodified here? Our focus is very much on, can we shape this? And can we shape the future of that and direct the power of those forces, those financial forces and that data into something that's generally positive and make real change? And for us, it comes back to stories, and this little sort of phrase here has been a wee bit of a mantra for African Highlands, which is really sort of saying, we're really going to galvanize people, bring them together around a vision that's looking into 30 years hence, and we're trying to move from a point of division and conflict to something that we can share together. Then how powerful is this story? And I think if we get those stories right for whatever our landscapes are, we map and we tell authentically how we see people and nature together in that future. I think that's how we direct that kind of that financial power, that market power, which can otherwise just overwhelm us. So that's I guess really what our job is here, is to try to connect people so we can share in that story and then plan tangible ways of taking it forward. And we very much enjoy that challenge, but it'll be one that lasts the whole 30 years. And I'll leave it there.
Alan, thanks so much. It's great to hear the story of that project there, but also the fact that you're ending on the importance of telling those stories. I know it's something that Ciarán and I have talked about in the past. Ciarán's mentioned a few times the importance of communicating the story of what is being done both by Coillte Nature and the Nature Trust, but it's something that you seem to have really landed on up there in the Highlands. Look, I see we have a lot of questions coming in. I have a number of sort of questions that we've discussed really that come out of a lot of the common challenges and opportunities already identified by the members and nature-based enterprises on our platform. So we might touch those questions I have first, because I think they will go some way to addressing some of the questions in the Q&A, but we'll leave some time at the end for the questions in the Q&A. It's okay. So the first one here is really around opportunities for what we call nature-based enterprises, which is essentially private organizations or small to medium enterprises delivering nature-based solutions and related services. So you both kind of touched on this to an extent. Alan, you mentioned, say, regenerative tourism businesses, or Ciarán, you mentioned some of the private companies that do the forest or the tree planting. I even see a question there about the fencing in the Dublin Mountains makeover. But we're familiar enough, and I've seen with Rewilding Europe as well, that there is any number of companies involved in large-scale projects of nature-based solutions and fulfilling a multitude of roles, from the initial planning and design phase of these projects through to implementation, be that the tree planting or otherwise. And then, of course, that longer-term ongoing management, stewardship, and maintenance of these projects. So with that in mind, I guess from landscape architecture to regenerative tourism, water management, or agriculture, can you give any opportunities or examples from your own experiences of how companies like this can get involved with larger scale projects? And what advice would you have for SMEs or nature-based enterprises listening? We might go to Ciarán first, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the one that springs to mind first to me, and this is a call I was on this morning, was just around measurement metrics. So, you know, we've very good ways now of measuring carbon from, you know, mature science behind it, and really good remote sensing techniques. But I think measuring ecological uplift, measuring biodiversity, that's a real challenge. There's all sorts of interesting technologies emerging there, so eDNA technologies and acoustic technologies, all sorts of interesting things happening there. But organizations that could provide that service, I think, are going to be really interesting to these projects. Also, I just think the actual execution of them, the actual doing of them, that's our, you know, I was saying earlier on, we're not finance constrained at the moment. I've been involved in environmental projects for a lot of my career. In the past, we were always scratching around looking for finance. That's not the issue anymore. We're project constrained, and we're capacity constrained. It's, you know, can we get the land? Can we find the contractors and the people with the skills on the ground to deliver them? So, you know, in my mind, there's a really bright future in this area. I'm looking at the west of Ireland, looking at the peatland restoration projects we're looking at. We need skilled contractors who are used to working on peatlands that carry out that work, reprofiling using the latest techniques. Bringing new people into forestry in my own area, we're having a real difficulty getting young people to choose forestry as a career. I think it's got there's a very bright future in this area, but it's up to us to kind of spell it out and tell the story and show what it might look like in the future.
I think nearly sorry to cut across you, but nearly to Alan's point, I wonder, is there an opportunity in doing that, telling the story correctly in this nature restoration story that is becoming more and more apparent for people? Can that help in a recruitment drive in forestry, or for more ecologists to come into the sector? Or
yeah, I know, absolutely. I met two young university students who are working with us for a few weeks, and we just had coffee yesterday, and I was asking how they got into it, and it was this passion, it's nature restoration that drove them into it. So there's it's the right ethic. It's just we need more. You know, we need greater numbers, and we need to go at this with the same zeal that people applied in the past on other big projects. When I showed those graphs of afforestation in Ireland in the 1950s, 1960s, there were, you know, thousands of people at scale planting these forests. We need to kind of move beyond kind of pilot projects. We need to move into scaling up and going big if we're serious about this climate change and biodiversity challenge. We know what to do. We just need to get the numbers, deploy the capital well, get the right people into it, and address it at scale.
Thanks, Ciarán. Alan, would you like to come in on that?
Just to agree, really, I think two categories. There's the direct stuff around natural capital, and then I think that is going to be significant. And peatland in particular actually requires both skill and capacity. The integrity of it is going to require measurement, and that's where the role of ecologists come in. So I think we are talking about good jobs here that are land connected. People being out about, definitely, I would have loved a job like that, was offered out 20 years ago. And also come with a sense of autonomy. So I think that ability to recruit in the way you suggested, Ciarán, is there to inspire people. So say this is entirely future relevant to your generation and the ones that follow you. What I think is also relevant is economic activity that is nature-based and sustainable. And farming is an obvious kind of trade, if you like, that can go down that road. And there are models of that work commercially. Forestry really interests me in terms of what's possible there in terms of nature-friendly forestry. Is a really inspiring project near me where a couple bought some commercial woodland and converted it, or gradually converting it into native woodland. And they've imported on eBay. They bought French silviculture books and they translated those. So they're applying a very different approach to forestry that can have a continuous cover, long-term income stream. And they see on their 40 hectares, their calculations, yes, well, there's enough income there for a job and a half, which is not bad from 40 hectares. And in a rural community, that's where there could be these kind of small but still locally significant income streams from really rewarding jobs. I think I hope there's a lot of interest in that in the future and more policy support for that in the future, because those are the sorts of ways you put together quite a diverse jigsaw of an economy that's living within the bounds of nature.
Thanks, Alan. Just pulling a few of these questions together based on what you're all saying. So there does seem to be a challenge in recruiting enough people into the sector, okay, and having enough people to deliver on the demand that there is for some nature-based solutions at the moment. We also see and have heard of a challenge in scaling nature-based enterprises. But we're saying here that there is the financing there for some of these projects. Would you see that our education sectors, both in Scotland or Ireland or elsewhere in Europe, are they starting to respond to this demand for more professionals in this space? And can that be answered by public education systems, or is there a role there for private education organizations in this space to help meet some of that demand?
So I know that in Scotland, I had in fact a conversation this morning, Forestry in Scotland, which is the equivalent of COCHA here. They calculate that from a combination of just natural wastage and turnover, they would need to recruit 174 people a year. And last year, the Scottish School of Forestry produced 11 graduates. So 11. Now I know that they're only one source, but they'd be the main source of bespoke forestry training. They do have quite a nature element to their forestry program now. So that's there, but I think some of what we need is a combination of outlook, who are people kind of looking for this sort of, I guess, a more nature-based approach and looking into that. I think our vocational education system is still quite trained on conventional forestry, conventional farming. And so that feels a little behind sort of opening up what people see as possibilities. I think we need to complement that with some quite specific skills training, which could come more from the private side, or people as entrepreneurs, kind of putting together different approaches and working with some of the cultural organizations that are out there. So we have in Scotland, we have an association of small hardwood sawmillers, for instance. You can provide more of that. Here's how you work with hardwood forestry and produce commercial products in a sustainable way from a native woodland or a mixed woodland. So I think that actual practical skill for me feels like the biggest gap.
Yeah, no, I echo everything Alan said there, and the challenge that you described in Scotland is identical in Ireland. Very small numbers coming through, and we need to be recruiting. So it's certainly a place as a shortfall. We're hiring young foresters from all over the world now. Shortage of homegrown. One of the things I think we need to look at as well as mid-career people who want to convert and come into it, and maybe come in with other skills, come in with skills, legal skills and finance skills and project management skills and so on, to bring them into this area. So there's a kind of perhaps a real role for conversion courses, conversion masters, mid-career conversions. I think could be really interesting. And I mean, you're offering really fulfilling roles, real kind of life fulfilling roles. People, a lot of people I meet are looking for fulfillment, and they're driven by this, and the possibility to work in a space where you can, feel like you're making a difference is a tremendous motivator. Alan, the world you described, I think it's a really strong one. We're working really in the public space. When we buy land, we put it into this organization called the Nature Trust. It's open access and so on, but we really need to crack the private landowner, and make it interesting to the private landowner to stay on the land and to make it viable. And in Ireland, because of our history, you saw my graph, we only really began to incentivize the planting of private land with trees in the 1980s. But I don't think our farmers really think of themselves as foresters. They're kind of farmers with some trees on their land. So we really need to kind of grow that culture. I look at what they do in Sweden. They have some excellent kind of co-ops that bring farmers together, allow them aggregate their products, drive good prices at markets, really build skills and really build knowledge of markets, and allow them, think this in the long term and for the future. The finance piece I described earlier on it's great. It's very hot at the moment. It's in a position where projects are credible, quality projects are in short supply, so you can drive the terms you need. But we need to make that long term. We need to make sure this is not just a kind of a flash, that it actually is long term and sustainable. And there's a good stream there, because that allows people and organizations to plan for it. It allows people to plan careers around it. It allows contractors to borrow money to buy machinery, and for people to actually lean into it and place bets on it. So we need to give that security of supply. But if you look at the challenge, no matter what way you look at the challenge, there is going to be so much work in this area. Certainly in my jurisdiction for the next 30 years, really is going to be very, very busy. And I can name any amount of enterprises are going to be required to scale up. That's the big challenge, is bringing people in behind it.
Thanks, guys. We might move on to some of the questions now from the Q&A. I'm conscious that we have 10 minutes left, and we do have a hard stop, folks, at 4 UKI time, 5 p.m. CET. So let me see. I see a question here from Roisin Byrne. For landowners, do we understand what the barriers are to continuous cover woodlands? We are being told we are too highly elevated for trees to go well, but we have done it anyway, and it's a beautiful ecosystem. And currently, there is a highly competitive subsidy for keeping animals. Alan, do we understand these barriers?
I think there's a bit of that. Certainly here, the debate when continuous cover is raised, wind throw is the scary beast in the room. And there are a lot of people who work in kind of who are more familiar with it, say, well, that needn't be the case. And so there's a bit about how you operate selective felling and being conscious of where your edges are, where the exposure is, your diversity of species as well. So I think there are risks to be aware of with continuous cover, but I think as well it's moving away from what we have here is a kind of plant and clear fell orthodoxy, so you've got lots of species of the same age, and if you open an edge, you can let the wind in, and then you lose a lot of your crop prematurely. If you're moving away from that model to a more natural forest and you're looking to extract timber from that, you can work at different scales and come out with high value products. So straight stems, hardwoods. That plant that Woodland I mentioned that a couple have brought there, they're actually working to see if they can grow commercial holly, for which the prices can be like sort of £5 a cube apparently, because it's for real these kind of niche furniture making. So going for high end stuff that takes quite a lot of care and attentive silviculture. So it's a very different mindset, and I think that's where some of the barriers come kind of from humans who are used to conventional forestry and saying that it's done this way, and if you do it differently, then you'll get this set of risks where actually what we're talking about is a completely different system in the first place. So it's probably just about, I think a lot of that's just about saying, well, this works in other places and we can import those practices, and there are advantages to having that in our forestry mix alongside conventional approaches.
It does seem there's a lot to be learned from different countries and different practices and projects across the rest of the globe, and it's a case of making those networks and connections through platforms like the Connecting Nature Enterprise platform. Cheap plug. But the education piece seems to be coming through quite a bit in these questions. I just note the last two comments. So Aaron has asked, does the panel believe the limited interest in forestry careers starts with the disconnect in the curriculum, and we need to encourage more nature connection within schools and with young people who may have limited opportunities to experience nature? I mean, I'll just mention Siobhan's question before that. Siobhan works in Horizon NUA and with Trinity College. We're involved in a project called NBS EduWorld with the European Commission. They're leading on industry requirements from third level and vocational education. Important feedback that you've already given on education. A great point on mid-career transition possibilities. But look, coming back to Aaron's question, this connection with nature in the curriculum for our young people. Ciarán, can I put that to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think the curriculum, I suppose, has a finite capacity, you know. So you know, what do you get into it? I mean, obviously you'd like to emphasize this area more. What I would say is I think there's probably I think forestry as a sector has been very poor at telling its story. It's quite an inward looking sector. And up until quite recently, it really wasn't. It was kind of a sleepy backwater, really, of land use, and you know, got on with its thing and did its own thing. And foresters kind of looked after forests, and you know, people pretty much ignored what was going on. So I think forestry hasn't been telling its story well. So there's lots of misunderstandings of what it is and what kind of careers are in forestry. So people, you know, imagine it as being you know, you're outdoors, it's, you know, check shirts and all that sort of stuff, chainsaws. It's actually really, really high technical now, with a really wide range of skills required there. So I think there's a duty on us to kind of explain what the range of roles are, tell the story. Really, I mean, I've been involved in this area for 11 years, and I could not have imagined the diversity within it when I came into it first. It's a really, really diverse role. I suppose technically complex, and also, you know, forestry is as much about people as it is about trees. You know, it's dealing a lot. I mean, it's dealing a lot about what we want from our forests, what human beings want from their forests, or what our expectations are, and the context in which they're located. So it's really explaining that to people. I think once people come into it, I mean, I think people who put it on their you know, university forms, or whether at the end of school and they're planning careers, generally their motivation is really good, because they've generally been driven by some sort of ethic of sustainability or stewardship, or the need to work in nature. So the right people are coming into it. Could you develop that more? Perhaps you could, but from what I've got a teenage daughter, and I'm very encouraged by, you know, what I'm hearing back from her generation. It does seem to be a really an awareness that was not there in my generation. It was certainly very, very niche when I was that age. It seems to have been much more mainstream. So I would be hopeful in the future for that.
Thanks, Ciarán. Great insight. Guys, we are coming to sort of 2 minutes left. So unfortunately, we won't get to any other questions. What I might do is pull out any ones we've missed and send them on to the two speakers. We might be able to get back to people that way after today. But I think, look, what's coming from that, both people have talked about the standards required and the integrity required in these projects and the importance of involving people and that human connection with nature, as well as the history of the land and the traditional values over the last 200 years, Alan mentioned in the Scottish Highlands. So we need to be delicate and understanding as we make those changes and look to implement ecosystem restoration on a larger scale. I think most of us on this call are conscious and aware of that, and we'll hopefully continue to tell that story. For anyone interested in following, do check out Ciarán Fallon's work with the Nature Trust on their website. We've shared that in the chat earlier, and likewise follow Alan's work in the African Highlands. Trees for Life are around on Twitter as well as on their website and LinkedIn, so you can follow accordingly. As far as the Connecting Nature Enterprise platform, we will post some key takeaways as well as this recording in the coming days up on the website. Do feel free to join the different communities there that you find of interest. And finally, as I mentioned, webinars will go quiet for the summer as people take holidays. We'll return in September, October. We'll let you know what's coming for those sessions then. But other than that, we're over and out. It's 4 o'clock on the button in Ireland, 5 o'clock over in Europe. Thank you very much again to Ciarán and Alan. And thank you to all our attendees. Any final words from Alan or Ciarán there? I'll leave the final words to yourselves. Thanks.
Thank you, Ciarán. Enjoyed it, and yeah, hope it's useful for everybody going forward.
Yeah, thanks for the invite. It was a pleasure to meet everybody today, and you've got my email address. Please feel free to drop me an email if you have any additional questions.
Great. Thanks, Ciarán. Thanks, Alan. Thanks, everybody.
Later.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Bye.